Good morning, Professor Warren Magnusson. Thank you for joining me in this interview on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the CSPT program. And since you have been a founder of the CSPT program, I would like to ask you a few questions about the program and how you came up with the idea of the program, how the program was set up, and so on. So thank you so much for doing this. So to begin with, I would like to ask you to describe to me the Warren Magnusson, who founded later on the CSPT program, how he was when he entered the University of Victoria.
Okay, I came here in 1979 actually as a visiting assistant professor, and at that time I'd been actually hired as an urbanist essentially, because my work is at the borderline between urban studies or the study of local government and political science and political theory. But a job in political theory opened up while I was here that first year, and I got the job, although they delayed regularization for a year. So I was regularized in 1981 as a political theorist, and as it happened, there was only one other political theorist in the department, and he resigned. And Rob Walker had come and was teaching part-time for us, part-time for UVic. And then he was hired as political theorist and was regularized in '81. So the two of us, in a sense, had a fresh start to make in the department. We were the theorists in the department. Both of us were new. In my case, I'd done political science and economics at the University of Manitoba, and a little bit of philosophy, and then went to Oxford for my graduate work, and ended up doing a dissertation that was about theories of local government. I was particularly interested in the issue of direct democracy at the neighborhood level. I suppose inspired by ideas about the New England town meeting, inspired by some of the things that Hannah Arendt had said in On Revolution, where she reflected on these things, but even more influenced by what I thought was a silence in thinking on the left and thinking amongst Democrats generally about what a new post-capitalist socialist society could be like. So at the time, I started thinking about this very late in the 60s and early in the 70s. There was a lot of interest in industrial democracy, workers' control, trying to think through what that would involve. A kind of critique of the Soviet model, influenced a bit by some of the things that had gone on in Yugoslavia, but also influenced by other thinking about what it would mean to democratize the economy. But it seemed to me that that wasn't enough, that if one was serious about democratization, it also meant being serious about local institutions and practices, and hence about local government, which is a subject that no one wants to think about because it seems very boring, particularly within political science. It's a branch of public administration, gets down to the details about how programs are administered and all that sort of thing. And there's not very much critical thinking about ideas of local government. So I was very interested in notions of decentralization, which led me back to some of the work that was being done immediately after the First World War, people like G.H. Cole and the Webbs, and then that in turn led me back into an investigation of thinking about the modern organization of local government, which in turn took me all the way back to the late 18th century. So the dissertation I wrote was really about trying to figure out why there was such a strong consensus across left and right about the need for abolishing traditional local institutions and reorganizing local government on a very large scale so that nothing like direct democracy would be possible. So, in effect, taking the model of the state, the nation state, and applying it to local institutions. What was the rationale for that? In a way, that has been a central concern of mine ever since. I think there's a huge gap in thinking about that. So that was the kind of intellectual background I had when I came to UVic. I'd finished my dissertation, I taught a little bit elsewhere in Ontario, published a little bit based on my dissertation, but not a great deal yet, and was still feeling my way forward. So that was the person who came to UVic in 1979. Was delighted with the opportunity to teach political theory rather than being stuck teaching about local government, which is not as interesting. And even more delighted when Rob turned out to be my companion in teaching political theory.
Describe the UVic political science department when you joined.
It was generally pretty conservative. There had been a wave of hiring in the 1960s, so a number of Americans had been hired at that time who did kind of standard form American political science. There was another generation, as it were, centered on Walter Young, who was a major figure in the NDP and a student of the CCF NDP, which was a bit more progressive, but still, in terms of their approach to political science, fairly traditional. So at the time, Rob and I were in a minority of two in the department as people who were interested in exploring new approaches, both of us being influenced in different ways by Marxist and neo-Marxist thought, German critical theory, and I think Rob more than me by French post-structuralist thought in its various forms, but generally being interested in what the implications of all these different critical currents were for thinking about politics. And so we were always agitating for broadening the field and introducing new ways of doing political science. And there was a fair bit of resistance to that, shall we say, from within the department. And it was also the case that after we were hired in '81, the department was more or less frozen. And I think there was one hiring in the 1980s, but it was a time when no expansion was allowed and there wasn't a lot of turnover until the end of the 1980s. The conservatism of the department was maintained, shall we say.
How large was the department?
There were, I think, a dozen of us at that time, and it remained that size actually until for the next 20 years. There was some turnover, but the department stayed the same size.
How did you come up with the idea of a CSPT program?
Well, at the time, the political science had a fairly modest MA program. It had started in the 1970s and then was reorganized a bit in the 1980s. And because Rob and I both attracted some students, that gradually a program that had focused very much on Canadian politics was beginning to attract political theory students by the mid-80s. But this is a small program, a small thesis-oriented program. The other thing that went on was that we began to find that there were a number of students who, in the philosophy department, who took some political science and were interested in some of the same thinkers as we were. And they weren't having very much opportunity to explore those thinkers in the philosophy department for two reasons. One is that philosophy had an Anglo-American emphasis, and there were only two philosophers, Monica Langer and John Magnusson, who were interested in continental philosophy. And most of these, the new currents that Rob and I were interested in, came out of or were influenced by continental philosophy. So students in that department, the undergraduate level, who were attracted, who wanted to read the French post-structuralists or the German critical theorists or whatever, were finding that there wasn't much room for them to do that in the philosophy department. And the philosophy department decided sometime in that period, I've forgotten exactly when, to sort of cut back on its graduate program on the grounds that they weren't getting enough funding for it. So they weren't taking very many students. Sometime in that period, Rob and I got to know Monica and John a bit more, and as well as some of their students. And what was happening is that some students who would otherwise have gone on for an MA in philosophy decided to switch after doing their BAs in philosophy to political science so that they could do political theory. We had to do a little bit of work to convince our colleagues that these people were well enough qualified in political science to do an MA, even though their major had been in philosophy. So there was some pressure for them to do a bit of makeup work, understandably. But fortunately, political science was fairly flexible in that regard, much more flexible than sociology, in terms of taking people with degrees from related disciplines into our graduate program. It's still fairly flexible in that regard. At the same time, there was also an overlap with some students with sociology, particularly when Bill Carroll joined the department there, which was at the same time as Rob and I were regularized. He and Rennie Warburton were beginning to teach sort of neo-Marxist thought, contemporary Marxist thought, and they were attracting students who were interested in some of the same thinkers that we were and that the philosophy students were interested in. So that was the context in which we realized that there were students in all three departments who weren't necessarily being served very well at the graduate level, who actually wanted to read things that weren't, as it were, weren't on the curriculum in their own departments, but serious material, important material. And clearly it was material that could benefit from a cross-disciplinary investigation. So the idea of bringing together students from the three departments who seriously wanted to read whoever, Foucault or Habermas or Nietzsche, began to take shape in our minds, I think, all of us. I guess the other factor that I'd actually forgotten about was that Bill and Monica and Rob and I were all involved in editing a book in 1983-84 called The New Reality, which was a response to a BC government program of what they called restraint, which really was the first implementation in Canada of the kind of principles that we now identify with Thatcher and Reagan. And it led in the fall of 1983 to the province to the verge of a general strike. It was a very dramatic set of upheavals, and that was the context in which some of us came together. I guess I ended up as the coordinator of this, thinking we have to put together a book in response to what's going on. And that became this book called The New Reality, which sold very well. For a little book for a BC audience, it sold over 5,000 copies, and it was for sale on the ferry, actually, to Vancouver. And so Rob and I got to know Bill and Monica a little better in that context of doing that book. We did a second book that came out in 1986, and we had a little committee called Committee on Alternatives for BC that was operative for a few years. So there was that sort of political background of shared political commitments and concerns, but also these more intellectual concerns about opening our fields up. So it was in that context that we began talking to one another about what we could do for our graduate students, and gradually this idea took shape of the CSPT program. One of the inspirations for that was the Social and Political Thought program at York University in Toronto. But we thought that we wouldn't follow that model, which is of an entirely separate program, for two reasons. One is that we were concerned about what would happen to our graduates afterwards if they didn't have disciplinary degrees. So we came up with this model in which people would get disciplinary degrees, but then they'd also get the CSPT qualification in addition to that. And we also knew that, given the fact that in the case of all three departments, the proponents of CSPT were in a small minority. Basically two people who were, in many respects, at odds with the rest of their department. And I had ideas about graduate education that were not shared. That the only way to sell the idea to the three departments was to say, in effect, look, we are not going to disturb any of you at all. Everything stays the same. This is an addition to what we're already doing. There's no change in the requirements for a degree, no alteration in the courses that we're going to offer. Everything stays the same. And in the model, it was to get the CSPT qualification, students have to do 2 extra courses on top of all the courses they do. And the field has to be broadly in the field of CSPT, those 2 requirements. And that was that we found was in the end an unanswerable case. I mean, how do you argue against a program that demands a lot more of the CSPT students and doesn't disturb anything the existing departments are doing? So we sold that idea partly through the department, but also, fortunately, the deans concerned were reasonably supportive. Graduate studies didn't have a separate dean in those days, but the deans of humanities and social sciences, they were ready to listen to us, shall we say. The dean of social sciences at that time was a guy called Lou Costa, a psychologist, fairly broad-minded kind of guy. As I recall, I even took the case up to the vice president academic. I'm trying to pitch this thing as a useful thing. A lot of the details of that I've forgotten now, but we lobbied around and eventually got to the point that once we got approval in political science, then I think we got approval in sociology, and then in philosophy, and although there was a lot of grumbling in each department, we managed to get it through. And the other big thing is that we said this will, not only will it not disturb anything, it will not cost anything. It won't, no money out of the departmental budget. All that we need is that the deans provide a little bit of money for course release for people to teach the CSPT seminars, and that actually isn't a lot of money. It's about $5,000 or $6,000, which they agreed to provide out of sort of soft money rather than. They never did give us a budget line in that regard. And then we asked for a tiny bit of money for sort of administrative costs. And that tiny bit of money was I remember very distinctly, $700. $700 a year was our budget for CSPT. Other than course
Plus one
release.
course release.
No, the director got no course release.
Mm.
We didn't ask for that. We knew we wouldn't get that. So, $700, just the course releases for the people who taught the CSPT seminars.
Very interesting. When you pitched the idea of putting together a theory concentration program,
Right.
I want to understand in the ambience of time, like how people received it. What was training, specialized training in theory, and especially in this case, continental thought in general? Was that something that was, intelligible at the time? Like we are talking about 1988 and prior, when
Right.
you were actually thinking of this. I want to know, like, since you were in social science, in the political science department, how did the political scientists of the time receive this idea? Just the idea of training people in some kind of specialized theory program.
Well, I'd say that there was a little bit of a complex reaction. First of all, within political science, and in this respect political science is different from sociology, there's been long-standing acceptance that political theory is one of the subfields within the discipline and it's distinct. And that a fundamental part of that is the history of political thought going back to the ancient Greeks. So every political science department, everywhere, has at least one theorist and teaches courses on the history of political thought. So that's accepted. And it's also accepted that political theory has to be something more than that. And the dominant thing is Anglo-American style normative political theory. So a crossover between that and what the philosophers call moral and political philosophy. So kind of post-Rawlsian, in the 1980s, by that time Rawls was a universally recognized figure, and responses to Rawls were legitimate, shall we say, as an area of endeavor. So in the political science context, it was easy to say, well, yes, you can doing graduate work in political theory being a specialization, you didn't have to make that argument. People accepted that was true. Where the resistance came in was in saying, well, but political theory isn't just Anglo-American style political theory, and it isn't just the history of political thought, that there's other stuff going on. And I think the advantage that Rob and I had with regard to that is that we knew the literature, we knew what was going on, and it was just a matter of saying rather forcefully to our colleagues, look, that the things have changed, there's been a shift, and there's much more interest now in various forms of continental political thought. So, and figures like Habermas, for instance, everyone was becoming a bit aware of Habermas as an influential figure. In the 80s, less so the French thinkers, but French Marxist thought was something that people were aware of. So when I was a graduate student, and people like Althusser and Nicholas Balancis were the big figures, and that I always tell students now that nobody talked about Foucault then, everybody talked about Balancis. They don't know who Balancis is. Right? So there was at least an awareness that there was a current of, call it neo-Marxist thought that was important and influential and worth thinking about. And in a political science department, it may be easier than in other departments to say, look, there has to be diversity, that there can't be an orthodoxy, and we have to be open to different things. And so in the end, it wasn't all that hard a sell to say, this is a legitimate field of study. It came down to more like resource issues. And, you know, we're a small department, there are only a dozen of us, where do we want to focus our attention? That kind of issue. And that's why it was so crucial for us to say, look, we're not taking anything away from anything else. We're adding on through the CSPT program.
The CSPT was founded in 1988. How long prior to 1988 did you have to go through all this negotiation and setup and so on? I want to think about the sort of institutional processes through which finally in 1988 the program was set up. How long was that? How much of a how much did it take for the institution to set this thing up?
It probably was about 2 years altogether. I was on sabbatical in 87, 88. I'm trying to think exactly when we put forward these ideas, whether it was before my sabbatical or afterwards. I think we were certainly thinking about it before I went on sabbatical, because I was actually away actually I guess I was just away physically for half a year, the first part of 88. So I think we were talking about it in 87. Exactly when we approached the authorities, I don't know. I think probably the clearances at the departmental level would have been maybe in the fall of 88, and with sort of getting the approvals for offering our first course in the fall of 89. But I'd have to look at the paper trail to be absolutely sure of that.
Yeah, I do recall from the history of the CSPT, which I proudly possess, and probably you too also, but you have it probably somewhere in your files. But yes, the first recruitment of the CSPT program, fall 1989.
Yeah.
One student. Yes.
Yeah. Well, but we put on a seminar. That was the key thing. As I recall, I led the first seminar, and we got more people in that seminar than any of the other graduate classes in the 3 departments. So in a sense, we proved ourselves immediately. We had a really good-sized seminar and attracted top quality students from the 3 departments. So there was no question that there was student interest in this, because that was part of the reservation. Our students really interested in this. As soon as it was on offer, there was no problem. Lots of student interest.
So the students actually took the seminar course without being in the program.
That's right. Good, because from the beginning we said the seminars are open to whomever, and you could take it for credit basically as an option within your program. You didn't have to register in the CSPT program to be part of the seminar. So yes, the majority of students there were not looking for the CSPT designation, although I think some of them later on decided to get it. So once you'd taken 2 CSPT seminars, then kind of followed that you'd get one. You might as well get the designation.
You and Professor Rob Walker have been the CSPT director throughout the years for possibly the majority of the time.
Right.
Will you explain to me the process through which this directorship has been working, and all the challenges and so on that comes with directing this program?
Well, in the very earliest years, when I first took it on, first of all, there wasn't a very formal process for selecting a director. It was one of these situations where people looked around and eventually I said, well, okay, I'll do it. But I think that it's fair to say that in the sort of early stages of lobbying with the departments and making the case and so forth, that I'd taken a leading role in that. Although each of us was a spokesperson within his or her own department as well. And then it was mainly a matter of organizing the CSPT faculty to agree on who would teach the seminar in each upcoming term, because that was our major challenge. That we decided on this formula, which is not used anymore. We'd agreed from the beginning that if someone was teaching a seminar, there'd be a second faculty member sitting in on that seminar, who would be the person who taught the seminar the following term. So when I taught it, I've forgotten who sat in on the seminar with me, but I remember it when I taught the seminar second time. I remember sitting in on Monica Langer's Nietzsche seminar because I was scheduled to do the seminar following it. So part of it was just a matter of agreeing amongst ourselves who would do it, and that was always partly a matter of people negotiating with their departmental chairs the course release. So, but also trying to get a variety of different topics, since the CSPT seminars, the idea was it was always on a different topic, and so giving the students some variety over the years. So that was one thing. The other thing is we developed a brochure and sent it out as widely as we could, advertising the program, trying to recruit students, and posters that we put up around campus or that we could distribute at other universities. So there was a little bit of work involved in just advertising the program. And there was work involved in simply defining what the program was. And of course there are always some differences of view about exactly what it was. And that was partly a matter of how to represent the program to the outside world and to the individual departments. And some tricky political issues, both internally and externally, to negotiate in that regard.
The CSPT program started with the participation of 3 departments: sociology, philosophy, and political science. Could you tell us a little bit about the way these departments basically joined and then, took a departure from CSPT, and all of these processes of the 3 original founding departments of CSPT, 2 still remain, sociology and political science, although the weight of carrying CSPT forward has been always on the shoulders of political science, thanks to you and Rob Walker and later on Professor Arthur Croker and so on. So I would like to hear about these processes through which departments actually decided to join, and then somehow the idea was not carried forward.
Right. Well, the sociology has stuck with it through thick and thin, even though I don't think it's never been a very popular item in sociology. But and I don't know, Bill could tell you the story of that in a way that I can't. philosophy was always a problem, and one of the advantages we had right at the beginning is that John Nicholson, one of our participants, was chair of the department for a time. And so he was skilled in dealing with this department. So getting the CSPT affiliation through the philosophy department, I think, was down to him ultimately. Now, the problem that he and Monica faced is that they were the only exponents of continental philosophy in a department that was heavily in favor of the Anglo-American tradition and had people in it who just didn't think that what continental philosophers did was philosophy. A very, very hard line view, which, as you know, is not uncommon in philosophy departments. But the philosophy department kind of wound down its graduate program for a time. It's revived. And they, as I understood it, they got into a battle with their dean over various issues of funding, but also over gender preference. There was pressure from on high for all departments to do things to recruit more women. And the philosophy department took a hard line on that and said, no, we're not going to engage in any kind of preferential hiring, and we're strictly on merit and all blah, blah, blah. And I think what the dean said was fine, except I'm not going to give you any new appointments. So they were kind of stuck for a while, and they were saying, well, no appointments, then we're not going to expand our graduate program. They were kind of stuck in that kind of battle. And then I can't remember the exact context, but I recall, yes, philosophy finally did get approval for a new hire. This sometime in the 90s. And I was doing another stint as CSPT director. And the argument that my CSPT colleagues in philosophy were making within the department is that the new hire, which would be in the field of political theory, ought to be someone, or political philosophy rather, would be someone who could fit into CSPT. I tried to back them up on that. But I think my intervention in the matter didn't help the situation, shall we say. The then chair of the philosophy department got quite annoyed with me. And around that time, I don't know if they formally withdrew from CSPT, but in a practical sense they withdrew. And then first John and then Monica retired, and they weren't really replaced. So if anyone does continental philosophy in the philosophy department, they haven't let us know about it, shall we say. So there really hasn't been much, an effort to revive the connection with philosophy, because they seem to have turned away from CSPT and sort of reaffirmed their commitment to Anglo-American philosophy as the exclusive form of philosophy. I may be misreading that, but that's my impression as an outsider. But in the meantime, some people in the English department got more and more interested in CSPT, and the key person there was Evelyn Cobley, who did a couple of stints as chair of the English department, was good friends with Rob, quite interested in some of the same thinkers, but even more, but in a sense introducing a new set of thinkers who were of more interest to people doing cultural theory. People like Derrida and Lacan are central to Evelyn's teaching. So eventually, having in effect lost philosophy and hence lost our standing in the humanities faculty, we decided to move in the direction of English, because Evelyn and then at the time Snarl Cambarelli, who afterwards moved to Guelph, were both interested in the CSPT. So in a sense we formed a new alliance there. And they were able to persuade the English department to adopt CSPT as an option for their students. Part of the deal was to change contemporary social and political thought to cultural, social, and political thought, which was more welcoming to the English department. And so CSPT has become an important thing in the English department, which of course is a very large department with lots and lots of students. So English has become a really important element of the program since then.
What about the story with history department joining?
Well, it was more or less at the same time we were reaching out to English. We thought that it would be a good idea to have a second humanities department involved, and history showed some interest. I suppose the key person there was Greg Blue, who's still with the program. But there were a number of other people in the history department who showed some interest at the time. And history seems very sort of open to doing lots of different things. So there really wasn't any difficulty there in opening up that option in history for their students. Seems not to have been as successful in history as in English. I don't know all the reasons why. But I've never noticed any antagonism there towards CSPT. It's more a matter of a lack of interest, shall we say.
Well, one of the problems, perhaps, that CSPT is facing in terms of recruiting students is that certain departments, participating CSPT departments, actually offer 1-year MA programs, and the students expect, if they have an interest in CSPT, to also graduate within 1 year and move on to their PhD or whatever. And this has been an impediment to some degree, not entirely, to CSPT student recruitment. I think history offers a 1-year MA program. Political science offers a 1-year MA program, except that political science has managed to actually have an influx of students who are actually interested in CSPT and are taking
Right.
Are basically taking into account that they should they take this CSPT program, their program will not be 1 year. And there seems to be this kind of structural mismatch, if you like, between CSPT and some departmental degree conditions or requirements. Have you ever thought about trying to negotiate these things, or you always approached it in terms of management and directorship of CSPT, in terms of if the students are genuinely interested in CSPT, then they can actually spend maybe 6 months more or a year more doing this?
Well, it's always been a conundrum, because fundamental to CSPT is doing a thesis. In fact, in the political science department, and I think in sociology as well, there's a thesis component. And whatever the weighting you give to a thesis. The reality is that students cannot actually finish a master's thesis and do a proper job of it in 9 months, which is what the university, if you're going to finish in a year, in effect you have to finish in 9 months. You start in September and you go to defend in the summer at the latest, and given how grad studies insists on a month's warning before you have an oral exam and you have several people on the committee, it means people basically have to be finished their theses by June. So unless they come into the program knowing exactly what they want to do, so that they've figured it out as undergraduates and can then write a thesis on the basis of whatever they understood as fourth-year undergraduates, and they've got a supervisor who's willing to, how shall we say, not challenge the conceptions they had as fourth-year undergraduates. It's almost impossible for students to do a proper job of it, I think even in the regular program, let alone the CSPT program, in that short of time. So they're into a second year, and once you're into the second year, why not stay for the full year? Why struggle to finish before Christmas when you could take a little bit more time and do a proper job of it? But unfortunately, the funding model of the university, to the extent that it funds graduate students, which is very little, is entirely antagonistic to that. As is the students' union, demanding that funding for master's students be upfront, that they get money in their first year, and that if they stay for a second year, ideally they should have funding for a second year. But grad studies doesn't have the money for that. When we started the program, the actual assumption back in the 80s is that there would be no funding for graduate students. That it would be just like at the undergraduate level, and they paid your tuition and you somehow found the money to finance your own studies. That was the model, I think, that we had in mind in the 1980s, because there was never any significant funding from graduate studies. The old model we had, that basically each department got one university fellowship, and which was scholarship money. So the top student in each department got a fellowship, and we negotiated. This was, I've forgotten now, one of the things we negotiated is that the top CSPT student could also get one of these fellowships. But that's just one student. Everybody else was basically self-financed. And then the whole idea of what should happen in graduate funding changed. I don't know when you would date that from, but the expectation became that master's students as well as PhD students should be funded by the university. But here at UVic, the money to do that is, to put it mildly, scarce. So we've always been struggling with this fact that actually there isn't enough money there to provide the students with the support that they actually need for the kind of academic work that they're attempting to do. The problem is intensified for CSPT students because the program is actually more challenging. And the whole point of doing a CSPT MA is you come and you are challenged quite fundamentally. So you start out in September with all kinds of ideas, neat ideas you had as an undergrad about what kind of thesis you're going to write. And then you realize that you haven't read more than 5% of the stuff that you need to read in order to do that particular subject, and it's much bigger than you realized it was. And so you go through a crisis, and maybe by the end of your first year as an MA you have a sensible idea for a master's program, a master's thesis, which is actually great. I mean, it's educationally, it's what should happen at the graduate level. You should go through that kind of rethinking when you begin as a graduate student. But unfortunately, the funding situation is at odds with it. So going back to your question, I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. I haven't, in this department, I have not been in favor of the one-year program. I don't think it's a good idea. And it's a particularly bad idea for theory students. But I understand all the reasons the students have for saying we've got to finish in a year if we can. And if students are prepared to do that, I guess we've got to help them do that.
Just a comment on that, because I imagine the students will watch this, especially the CSPT students, and to use a sort of a quote by Jerry Zaslav, he says that the students nowadays are under siege, and it's really an interesting representation of student life nowadays. They are under siege, and so those who actually are interested in some kind of fundamental knowledge, kind of foundational knowledge in theory and so on and so forth, will actually have to pay some extra cost for that. And that is, as much as we are underfunded in terms of student funding and so on and so forth, you will be probably, multiply underfunded if you choose to go down the CSPT road, and that has been one of the impediments of.
Yes.
So there is some adverse conditions that, despite the institutional recognition that CSPT has scholarly merit and produces top-notch scholars of the future and so on and so forth, nonetheless there is this basically structural impediment to students pursuing that line.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really serious, and I've struggled trying to think what way out there is for us in this regard. And ideally we would have an independent funding source of some sort. We could raise money for the program, and there would be scholarship money for our students that wasn't under the control of the graduate studies or individual departments. That would be ideal. But given the nature of the program, I don't know that it necessarily appeals to that many bankers and folks like that. Maybe there are some, who knows?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I want to talk about the PhD program in CSPT.
Right.
That started a few years ago. How did you come up with the idea? How did the idea was pitched? How was it received by the institution and so on?
Well, the background to that is that when English became and history became members of the CSPT programs, they both were departments that already had PhD programs, whereas in political science and sociology did not. And those two departments, at about the same time, went through a process of developing doctoral programs. And I actually was chair of the political science department at the relevant time, which I was chair in 2001, 2003. And we were, in a sense, all the departments in social sciences were, in effect, invited by the dean, ones that didn't have PhD programs, to create programs with a vague promise that if we did that, we'd get up 2 more faculty positions, that there'd be some expansion. And for the departments like ours that have been frozen in size for a very long time, that was extremely attractive. So in political science, we went through a process of trying to think what kind of doctoral program we could offer here at UVic that would be different from the one offered at UBC and the new program that was just starting at Simon Fraser. What made us distinctive? Unfortunately, by that time, I could argue as chair and as member of the department that one of the things that made us distinctive was CSPT. And the department had changed sufficiently by that time that there was more or less universal recognition that that actually was true. My predecessor as chair was Jim Tully, who'd gone away to Toronto at that point, but eventually we lured him back. But Tully had come to the department back in, what was it, 96, partly because of our strength and what we'd done in CSPT and theory, and it was, for him, a congenial place to be. And Tully has such enormous prestige in the profession, as a political theorist, as a philosopher, recognized to the highest levels at the university as, you know, one of the stars, that helped us a lot. And so to make the argument within the department that we had to have a niche program in political science, and that one of our niches, not the only one, but one of them was CSPT, was an argument that I found went down fairly easily within the department. We designated a couple of other niches. And so our program from the beginning, when it was going through the approval process, had a CSPT component in it. And one of the advantages of CSPT in that regard was to address the resource issue. We're still a small department. How are we going to deal with students? And part of the argument I made is, well, CSPT means that in that area, we don't only have our own faculty in political science, we have all these CSPT faculty who can sit on committees for doctoral students and so on, and offer classes that are relevant. So that all went through fairly smoothly. I don't know the story in sociology. You'd have to talk to Bill about that. But once we did that, once we created our PhD program in political science, then we started attracting, I would say, certainly in the early years, almost all, but the majority of the best PhD applications that we got were in political theory, and there were people who wanted to do political theory, CSPT kind of stuff. And I think in the English department they were finding that some of the best students that they were attracting were also interested in CSPT stuff. And that was the, how should I put it? How do I date this? Oh, I guess by that time we'd attracted Arthur Croker as a CRC, and he'd set up his Center for Technology and Culture. And he joined the CSPT program. So we had obvious strength, and Tully came back. Rob Walker had been away, came back, and so suddenly we had 4 senior theorists in this department with different interests and a lot of strength. And Arthur, in particular, began to attract students who were not political science students, but are interested in CSPT and interested in culture and technology. I guess the other thing that was going on at that time is the university had decided that one of its strengths was interdisciplinary programming. There had always been this possibility of doing an interdisciplinary PhD or an interdisciplinary MA. And that was kind of ramped up in those years. This is in the 2000s. And so the issue arose of whether you could do an interdisciplinary PhD and get a CSPT qualification at the same time. And we debated that a bit, and eventually came to the conclusion, well, why not? That an interdisciplinary student could apply to CSPT, and we'd evaluate that and welcome students of that kind. So it became more flexible in that regard. But I think the key thing was simply the fact of political science and sociology introducing PhD programs. So then it seemed like a logical thing to allow for CSPT at the PhD level as well as the master's
I do recall, however, that prior to setting up a PhD program for CSPT, we did have ad hoc PhD,
Yeah,
students. For example, Dr. Bill Little, who is now teaching in the sociology department, he was
Right.
one
that's right.
one of the original
Yeah.
CSPT PhDs before the
Yeah.
PhD program.
That's right. Yeah.
So basically, you had had some experience, so
That's
to
right.
speak,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I would like to hear your thoughts about the idea nowadays, especially amongst the top ranks in the university. The ideas about how interdisciplinarity is important and so on and so forth, and it's being pitched as something, the way to future and so on. In other words, there is a recognition that interdisciplinarity is probably a way to go. However, this interdisciplinarity is always challenged by institutional silos, by institutional setup, and it's not necessarily that the administration does not like interdisciplinarity. It's just the way the university, the academy has been set up, is set up across these boxes that basically don't talk to each other. And when you try to set up something interdisciplinary and reach over to the other box, you just run into a whole bunch of, institutional problems. Do you see a future in this sort of, at least nowadays, discursive turn, so to speak, to interdisciplinarity in academy, in general?
I think there is a future, but it's very hard to get interdisciplinary programs established at a time when universities are cutting back across the board, which is what's happened at UVic and at other universities. And as soon as that happens, then the individual departments get very jealous of their own resources. They feel very threatened by the idea that if there's new money, it's going to go to an interdisciplinary program rather than an established disciplinary program. And each department has good arguments to the effect that they need more resources to do disciplinary things. What helped us back in the early 2000s was that the university actually had, the only time in my career when the university seemed to have a little bit of money for new programming that it could direct to something other than the sciences. And students won't like to hear this. Unfortunately, that was the consequence of the neoliberal government that came in 2001 allowing universities to raise student fees. So it was there were dramatic increases in student fees, and that gave the university a little bit of money that it could use for new programs. That's more or less dried up now. But there was a few years, the only time in my career when you could actually talk to a dean and the dean would say, well, that's an interesting idea, give me a proposal. Don't ask for too much money, but give me a proposal. Before that and after that, it was more like the situation back in the 80s, where, as I say, the whole premise of CSPT was that it wouldn't cost them any money at all. Now we're in a situation where, which in one respect is more favorable, and there is this discursive turn towards interdisciplinarity. There's a recognition at the higher levels that it's a good thing. But getting them to put any money behind whatever you suggest is really difficult, partly because they're in a genuine financial crunch. They don't have a lot of spare cash, and there's a lot of pushback from individual departments who are saying, well, we're being asked to cut back, how can you possibly fund these new initiatives? So it's going to be difficult going forward, and it's going to be particularly difficult because the universities have bought into this idea that they have to have other sources of funding. Otherwise, in other words, they have to go to private donors to finance things. So if you're in a position to say, well, we've got this great new idea and there's this multi-billionaire out there who's willing to give us a few million to make this thing go, then the university will listen to you. But if you're just saying this is a good idea and you should put some money into it, it's really hard.
I would like to ask you about the way you see the future of our program. Not only where it's going, but also where it should go.
I'm actually of two minds about this. One of the great things that's happened in recent years is that the faculty involved in CSPT have become much more diverse in terms of their interests and disciplinary backgrounds. And, so there are a lot of people who've signed up to the program and expressed an interest in CSPT who bring knowledge and experience and theoretical backgrounds that we lacked before. So in terms of what's available to students, in terms of the range of faculty resources, I think it's a wonderful thing. There's a great variety there, great strength. And I think that partly that's a sign that some of the resistances that we've faced in the 80s and into the 90s have been overcome, and that at least partly, that they're younger faculty are just more open to a variety of different perspectives, a variety of different ways of doing academic work than the previous generation was. So that's all positive, and I see that continuing. I do have a worry, though, about what's going to happen in relation to theory, in that the premise of CSPT at the beginning is that it's a theory program, and that the expectations would be that the seminars we'd offer would be theoretically challenging, that the program was really for students who were interested in theory in some sense of that word, and were willing to read outside their own discipline, read really difficult theoretical texts, learn to read really difficult theoretical texts, and talk about them in an interdisciplinary context. I worry that as we broaden the scope and bring more people in who don't necessarily think of themselves primarily as theorists, that it'll become harder for the program to maintain the kind of theoretical challenge that the program is supposed to offer to students. I don't think that's an insuperable difficulty, but it's something that I think that people in the program are going to have to attend to in going forward, particularly in terms of what happens in the sort of core seminar. We've got to keep in mind the kind of critique that mainstream Anglo-American philosophers would offer of what we do, i.e. it's not rigorous enough. I don't think that's true, but there is always a danger that instead of theory you get a kind of intellectual tourism, that people are exposed in a very superficial way to a lot of different things, but they're not really challenged to read stuff in a way that would put their originating ideas at issue. So that seems to me the challenge that CSPT is going to face, to maintain the theoretical rigor.
Professor Magnusson, do you have any stories to tell us about CSPT? Anything that might have stuck in your mind throughout the years?
Oh, dear. Well, most of my memories associated with it are connected to how good the students have been. I mean, we have had wonderful students over these years. As you were mentioning before, to do CSPT takes a certain courage, because people are being pushed in a disciplinary direction. They're being pushed towards being careerists, and CSPT is this, in a sense, this island of intellectual activity in which they're being allowed, in a sense, they're being allowed to be free, encouraged to be free, encouraged to be genuine intellectuals who pursue the ideas wherever they go, and ask all kinds of critical questions about how we know things, how we make moral and political judgments, how to engage with the world as it is. Year after year, I'm astonished by the quality of the students that we attract. They're eager, they're interested, they want the intellectual challenges, but also the political and moral challenges that are involved in coming to terms with these things. And so, I don't have a specific story, but it's just I'd like to say thank you to all those students over the years who've I've learned a huge amount from them, and I've been so impressed by their commitment and their desire to know.
Warren, thank you so much for participating in the 25th anniversary of CSPT Foundation, and I think we are going to hear more from you in the CSPT conference of this year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Pam. It's been great.